Hello, everyone. My name is Ronaldo Cochran, radio talk show host at KXEN 1010 AM here in the St. Louis, Missouri area. Today, I bring to you an interview I had with Dr. David Bernard, the General Superintendent of the United Pentecostal Church International. This interview is in regards to recent allegations that was made in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper regarding race in the UPCI. Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Dr. David Bernard. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here interviewing you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to do it.
The first question I asked Dr. David Bernard was about diversity in the UPCI.
Well, first of all, let me give you just a little bit of background. I'm the General Superintendent, which is the presiding bishop or chief executive officer of the United Pentecostal Church International. We're an apostolic Pentecostal organization, and we currently have churches or members, constituents in 194 nations. That's out of 210 as identified by the Population Reference Bureau. And that's about 42,000 churches worldwide, about 5 million constituents, 4.9, somewhere around there. So if you look at the global scope, we're a majority non-white organization by far, because we have a very large number of constituents in Asia, Africa, Central and South America. In the U.S., we have been predominantly Caucasian or white. U.S. and Canada is our home base. We have 4,826 churches right now, about 10,500 credentialed ministers. But while we are majority Caucasian or white, because that is the majority population historically of our country, we've always had racial minorities. But in the last, I would say, certainly 25 years and even more, I would say for 40 years, we've tried to be intentional. But I would say in the last 10 years, we made significant progress. And I can talk more about that, but what do I mean is that when you look at our total constituents in the U.S. and Canada, our home, we're estimating right around 30% or 33% is either Hispanic or African American or Asian American, Native American. So almost 1/3 of our total constituents. So that's a significant increase. But what I try to focus even more on is leadership. So leadership at the general level and leadership at the district level. When I say district, that usually corresponds to states or provinces, or some large states may be subdivided, some small states may be put together. But for general purposes, that's like the state level. And so I've tracked leaders at the state level of our different, let's say, our district boards or district leadership team. And I became General Superintendent in 2010. And of course, many efforts were being done before I became superintendent, so I don't want to discount that. But this was on my agenda. Diversity is important because, number one, it's the will of God. I mean, God loves people. People are diverse. So it's a biblical thing. It's a spiritual thing, whether we think it's good or not, or, by that I mean whether we think it's going to lead to growth or progress, it doesn't matter.
Right.
We look at it, first of all, it's a biblical mandate. But then second, obviously, our society, our nation is becoming more diverse, so we need to reach the diversity of our society. And our churches are becoming more diverse just through natural, organic growth at the local level. Well, that means on the leadership level, we've got to reflect not only the increasing diversity of society, but the increasing diversity of our own church. It's not right if our members are diverse, but our leaders aren't. So I try to be more intentional. So I did the first survey in 2012. So it was a couple of years after I'd started emphasizing these things. Then we just did one in 2018. And in 6 years, we saw a 50% increase in diversity at the state level. So that's significant. As well as our national headquarters, our general board, our Urshan College, Urshan Graduate School of Theology, our faculty and staff. Now, there's a lot more that needs to be done, so I'm not here to say we've achieved everything we should or could, but I can definitely say we're headed in the right direction.
That's good. And I believe I viewed a couple of your videos, and you discuss the direction that UPCI is going. So I appreciate those numbers and figures, and I think that it's good for us to hear those figures again, so people have an idea of the direction that the UPCI is going. So let's step back a little bit, and for the viewers and those that might be listening,
Yes.
once we air it on KXEN 1010 AM, let's talk about the man, Dr. David Bernard.
Okay.
Now, I know you are, your husband, father, grandfather. Why don't you talk a little bit about your family? Give
Sure.
our viewers a background about yourself.
Well, probably something that's very important to understand me is my parents were missionaries to Korea. So we as a family went to Korea in 1965. They were the pioneers of the United Pentecostal Church of Korea. I was 8 years old. And so if you are trying to do math, I'm 62 right now. We'll be 63 later this year. But I grew up in Korea. At that time, it was a very poor country, a third world, economically very depressed. And of course, as a white person, I was a distinct minority, although a favored or privileged minority, being an American citizen and having middle-class income. But yet, I know what it's like to be the only person in the whole room that's of a different color, or on the bus, or walking home from school and people jeering or throwing rocks, calling names, maybe not maliciously, but because I'm different. They've never seen somebody like this before. They're trying to get my attention. They want to know what I'm like, And so I know what it's like to be the outsider. And my parents, this was 1965, they were from Louisiana. Of course, that is right in the middle of the civil rights struggles. But they were never prejudiced. And so they would not allow us to imitate or even use the language of our peers going to school. And of course, growing up in Korea, that removed me from the environment of segregation in America. But they started not only ministry among Koreans, but among American soldiers, which were both black and white. So we had service in Korean every week. We also had service in English, where the services were fully integrated. So I grew up in that environment. And what's interesting, some of the African American soldiers that were either converts or members later became preachers, pastors, leaders in the UPCI. Some became bishops in the POW, the PCAF, the Bible Way. And these are all apostolic organizations of predominantly African Americans. So, for instance, Bishop Showell is a past presider of the Bible Way Church. Well, I've known him for over 50 years, more than almost any other leader in the UPC, for that matter. So that background is helpful for you to know my life experience. I come not from a typical experience. And of course, I have two sisters. One is adopted Korean. So our immediate family knows the experience of an interracial family, interracial marriage. So I've got two nephews who would be Asian, Caucasian. I have two grandnephews who would be black and white. So now my immediate family, of course, I'm married. We've been married almost now 38 years to my wife Connie. We have three grown children, 2 boys and a girl. They're all serving the Lord, and they're all involved in ministry. And then I had 4 grandchildren. And then in 1992, I was 35 years old. My wife and I started a church in Austin, Texas. We started in our home. And from the outset, my goal was to be intentionally diverse. It took several years to get to that point. Actually, our first convert was a young African-American woman. But because it was a small church, we're starting, I'm Caucasian, it's going to be a lot easier to attract Caucasians, and people of other races may come and go, but they're going to wonder, Well, I mean, the pastor's white. There's only a few people. What kind of church is this going to be? You know, it takes time to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. But we did talk about and teach and preach diversity. And so I would just say I pastored full time, or I pastored for 18 years until I became General Superintendent. And our constituents grew to right around 1,000. And let me see if I can remember and get my math right. But as the time I stepped down as the senior pastor, we were right at 50% Hispanic. 50% Caucasian or white. The largest minority in our area is Hispanic. So we're, I think, 26% Hispanic. We were 18% African American or black. And we were 6% Asian American or other. And if I remember that right, that adds up to 100%. So we had a very diverse church, and that was reflected in leadership. We had people from about 30 different nationalities at any given time. So we had a lot of immigrants, and languages. We had ministry in numerous languages. During that time, we started what we call daughter work, 16 other churches in the area out of our church. 6 of those were Hispanic, Spanish speaking. And one was an African American pastor, one was a Korean pastor. So, we tried to practice diversity at the local level, at the leadership level. And so when I became General Superintendent, I felt like I had a background where I could say, look, we can do this worldwide.
Awesome. That's a powerful testimony right there, how everything started from your background to starting the church in Austin. It's just amazing what God has done in your ministry.
My next question is in regards to systemic racism in the UPCI.
First of all, yes, there was, you're referencing someone, an interracial couple who was licensed minister with UPCI and left last year, and they posted something on social media that went viral. And so let me say, actually, I had no idea of their feelings or thoughts. And so when I saw the video, I just had my administrative assistant pick up the phone and call and said, hey, you're in St. Louis, I'm in St. Louis, let's sit down and talk. And so the very next day, we sat down and talked. And we actually had a cordial conversation. I was pleased. And so here what I would say this. First of all, people's individual experiences are real. Now, some of them are subjective. We might have different interpretations, but I would not want to discount some of the things that they said or experienced. I do think they encountered maybe at some level racism or at some level insensitivity, and I will elaborate on that. So I don't want to discount or judge or denigrate their personal experiences or perceptions. I did try to research the specifics, and I also tried, it was interesting, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch recently did a major article, and the reporter also did a very thorough job of checking various references to see what he could find. So I'm probably the biggest experience they mentioned, I'll give you this example, they actually were converted within the United Pentecostal Church in California. So according to what they told me when we sat down and visited, they never had an experience of racism in Los Angeles, their home church, and ministering, and the man is Hispanic, the woman is black. They moved to Missouri. They wanted to start a church in the St. Louis area. She was hired here at headquarters as an African-American woman and worked with what we call our home missions department or division. And the thing that struck them that they related to me was when they met the Missouri District Board to get their ministerial credentials approval to start a church, the main thing that stuck out to them was, they weren't questioning doctrine and so on, which they were surprised. I would tend to think probably the board accepted the recommendations of whoever signed their application and trusted them. I would see that as a positive thing. But anyway, evidently one of the board members made a comment, well, your interracial marriage could limit you in ministry, and they understood it to be Southern Missouri. As I tried to track down, I talked to the 3 past district superintendents because I wasn't sure exactly which one might have been in charge. None of them could remember that. The person they remembered as saying that when he was asked, he couldn't really remember it either, but he thought it would have been a reference to the South, not Southern Missouri. But anyway, I wouldn't have raised that comment. I certainly understand how they would have felt. Look, here we are, church members, ministers trying to do the work of God, and we're wanting to be approved based on our qualifications, and you bring up an interracial marriage, which is not a biblical issue. You know, there's nothing wrong biblically. It is a matter of someone's personal choice as who they're going to marry. It shouldn't really be a biblical thing. So they took it as racial, and I understand that, and I regret that. I would not want to raise that issue because I don't think you should. However, I think I understand what the intent was, not to say we disapprove of you or we're going to limit you, or I think what it wasn't saying by law or by rule you're going to be prohibited from ministry. I think the person was well-meaning and saying, well, you just need to realize you could face some opposition, or you could face some limitation. I just want to make you aware of that. Just want you to be prepared. This was, 15 years ago or what have you. I do think it was a big shock to them coming from Los Angeles to Missouri. And of course, here in Missouri, we've got a lot of great churches, and they are diverse. But again, you're going back 15 years. In Missouri, in St. Louis, you have some very strong, predominantly African-American churches who are apostolic, which I preached, for example, for Bethesda, and had a great relationship with Bishop Johnson, who passed away a few years ago. And in fact, he was on our founding board of Urshan Graduate School of Theology by my invitation and request. I was the founding president. So, but looking at the dynamics of St. Louis, if you look at our apostolic movement, the roots of it, you've got some very strong African American churches. Whereas the UPC churches, the strength came from a lot of rural Missourians, people moving to the big city. So it's going to be predominantly white. So you do have a church culture that is, you're going to have some very large, predominantly black churches, some very large, predominantly white churches. Everybody's welcome to come, but there is that more of a distinction of the culture of the church, whereas in a place like Los Angeles, it has a different dynamic. So I do think when they moved to Missouri, they encountered rural Missouri, not only just in church, but even secular culture, and it was a big change. So I think they were very sensitive, and I do think there were some things stated that were wrong. As far as I can do the research, I didn't find anyone was being racially prejudiced against them directly, that I could identify a person. If there is somebody who is an open racist, we would deal with that. I remember many years ago, we had one of our ministers, this was actually before I became a minister, but the story was told to me. He joined white supremacist organization. Well, they took his ministerial license because that's a violation of Christian teaching. So, but I do think what we deal with a lot more is ignorance or insensitivity, where people say things or ask questions or do things not understanding how it's going to be, what impact it's going to have on somebody of a different race. And that is still an issue. And I would say another thing that's an issue in the Midwest, in Missouri, I've told you the positive side, but we still need more minorities in leadership. We need more visibility. So like when we have a district-wide function, and say there's a choir composed of people from different areas, well, there's an opportunity to be intentionally inclusive. And I think what they saw was that was lacking or lagging behind. That's a legitimate concern. That's a legitimate criticism, if you will. I don't think it's intentional. I've talked to the various leaders. Nobody is wanting to be exclusive, but what you have to do is be intentionally inclusive. And that's where we need to make progress. as I indicated to you a moment ago, we are making significant progress. But I would say in certain areas of the country, we still have to make a lot more progress.
I appreciate that, your response to that. So, Dr. Bernard, what do you say to those pastors that's in the United Pentecostal Church currently right now that's having a hard time adapting to the way the UPCI, the direction the UPCI is headed in for its inclusion, acceptance of interracial marriages? What is your response to some of those UPCI pastors that's having a hard time letting go of their old ways and the old philosophies and things of that nature?
Yes. And by the way, I probably need to circle back because I didn't fully address the issue of systemic racism. So, the charge is systemic racism. Well, I guess you would have to define what that is if the system is kind of stacked against minorities. I do feel we need to make significant improvements. I don't think there's a system that is stacked against or suppressing minorities, because we do have various minorities in key places of leadership, and it's intentional. So I think it's better to deal with, as issues come up, to deal with them head on. And so now to go more directly to your question, I've been, and of course this was before I became General Superintendent. It's ironic, but because of my writings and speaking, I was actually asked to preach for the General Convention of the Pentecostal Assemblies of the World, which is predominantly African American, before I was ever asked to preach for the General Conference of the United Pentecostal Church International.
Awesome.
So I like to rub that in every once in a while. Well, the PAW love me more than you did. So, but when I was asked to preach before I was General Superintendent back in, I think it was 2005, because of planting a church and growing it, they asked me to preach in the home mission service. And I devoted a segment of that message to racism is a sin and we need to be intentionally diverse. Now, to my knowledge, I'd never heard that actually preached from General Conference as a main theme. So I use that illustration to say one of the things I've done from the beginning is almost every major sermon, like a General Conference, I will inject some statement. Racism isn't just a bad idea. It's not just impolite. It's a sin. Or I'll say we have to be diverse, but you can't just say, well, we're open the church doors. Everybody's welcome. That's not good enough. You have to be intentional.
Right.
You have to identify people that are not like you. And if they're qualified, use them in positions. If you can't find someone qualified, that's not a good excuse. It's your job to train them. It's your job to develop them. So find good candidates and help them get qualified to become leaders. And a lot of times it's not racist, but you just normally, when you appoint somebody, when you're voting for somebody, when you're nominating somebody, when you're forming a committee, you just naturally think of your friends, the people you know, the people you've seen do things. Well, if you're not careful, you will exclude minorities just because you don't know a lot of people. So you have to go out of your way to expand the pool. When you start thinking about it, when you start meeting people, there are plenty of qualified people. So we're not saying promote someone who's unqualified as a token or to fulfill a quota. We're saying expand your experience and your pool with intentionality to pull more people in who are qualified or who can become qualified if given the opportunity. So I'm taking a little time here, but this is what I preach and teach to ministers. So my first answer, whatever systemic racism there might be, or whatever ignorance or lack of understanding, which I think is the bigger issue. In other words, if you ask a person, are you excluding a black person? No. But then, well, why isn't there a black person in the choir? Well, we don't have anybody qualified. Well, why aren't they qualified? So they're not thinking. They're just going about their business, which the point I make is if you're a real racist, and that's evil, But if you're just neglectful, although that's not as evil, the impact can be exactly the same, which is why somebody might feel they've been discriminated against, whether it was intentional or not. If it's through neglect or ignorance, the impact is the same, and therefore the feeling could be the same, and that's why you would say, well, that's systemic racism or whatever you want to say. But I would rather say, because I'm trying to be a change agent. So if someone is a racist, they need to repent. So they need to feel conviction. But if someone doesn't see themselves that way, but hasn't paid attention to the problems and is through ignorance or neglect, well, I don't want to make them my enemy by attacking them and labeling them. I want to say, look, I appreciate your good heart, your good intentions, but that's not good enough. You need to take another step. So I'm trying to bring people along. So I'm not trying to polarize. I'm trying to educate, trying to train. So my answer to your question is through intentional action, preaching, teaching, diversity training on the general board, and we're trying to get down to the district level, provide practical tools for diversity training. So by having the conversation, and so although the social media situation was kind of hurtful because I feel like a lot of people got a wrong impression or didn't get the full story, yet we could leverage that to a positive effect of saying, okay, we need to have this conversation. For those of you who think we don't need it, we're successful, we're gone past that, well, obviously not. So we need to be talking about this. We need to be doing something. We need to be training. We need to be making sure that we are intentional. So now I'm not having people, I'm not saying there is no racism, but I'm not having anybody openly trying to argue the other way. I think we've already won the ideological or the theological war. Now it's a matter of following through with practical steps that actually accomplish the goal. So with interracial marriage, yes, in the past, I've talked to people who felt like it's a sin. And I said, well, you're not in the Bible. They quote Old Testament passages that the Jews should not marry another tribe. I say that was theological. It was the people that worship the one true God were not supposed to worship or not supposed to marry pagan people because of the compromise. But if you look at Moses marrying the Ethiopian, and when he was criticized for that, God judged the people who criticized him. So if you're going to look at the Bible, we can't make that a doctrine. All people are the same race, really, in God's eyes. We're the human race. So let's stop talking about those things that are not biblical. We have to, we're a biblical organization. We take a stand of right and wrong based on what Scripture says, not on culture, not on personal preference. Now, if you're going to talk about interracial marriage, it's not a theological issue. It's just a matter of personal choice, personal preference. And yes, if somebody comes from two different cultures or two different backgrounds, and it doesn't necessarily have to be race. It could be urban versus rural, country boy and city girl, whatever, or Italian and Irish. Yes, you have to consciously decide, we're going to have to, these are two families are going to have to come together, two individuals. We may face some opposition or we may face some communication issues. So we have to know what we're getting ourselves into. So as a pastor, I would always approach from a practical side, and from an individual. The two of you are making a lifelong commitment. This is not just a whim. This is not just because you like each other. This is not to be some kind of symbolic step. This is a commitment of two people, and ideally, it's a commitment of two families. So you got to know what you're getting into. You got to talk about it. If you are going to face some opposition, you have to be ready for that. So we'll pray through it. We'll talk about it. And if you're both serving the Lord, you have the right goals, you're willing to make a commitment, then I'll marry you. It doesn't matter the race, but it does matter that you're willing to face whatever challenges. Of course, every marriage will face that. But an interracial marriage at least has the potential of facing a few more challenges. So I don't think we should pretend that doesn't exist. We just talk about it. and we make wise decisions in the will of God.
Thank you. And I know you mentioned that the UPCI is trying to implement changes for the general board, when there's a general conference. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some things that you guys are, now it may be in the early stages,
Yes.
but you're trying to implement more on the district level for equipping, the district level pastors with diversity training? Is there anything in the early stages that's heading toward that direction?
Yes. Well, let me explain what we've done and then what we need to do. First of all, it's important to understand we're a congregational organization. So the local church governs its own affairs. So headquarters doesn't have authority to tell local churches what to do. It's not like, say, the Roman Catholic Church or some hierarchical church. It's congregational. So the local church, the local pastor runs its own affairs. And then for our main offices, those are elected by the ministerial constituents. So given that, what we've tried to do from the top is, first of all, change the conversation. Talk about these things. Preach, teach, and promote from the top. So we're changing the culture, or we're taking a step forward in our church culture. So that's the high level. Second thing is where we do have discretion. So appointing committees, nominating people for positions, hiring people, then we can be intentionally diverse. And so my goal has been not to have not to try to promote tokens, unqualified, or quotas, but to expand the pool and intentionally involve more minorities in key leadership positions. So we are doing that. So then from the top, and we need to do more of that. So I'm not content. But I will say, in the last 10 years, we have about, I have to count them up now, but we have what we call divisions or ministries. We have 7 major ministries. So we're talking about global missions, North American missions, youth, children, ladies, men, publications. They all have governing boards. Every one of them now has minority representation. In most cases, both Black and Hispanic. And the general board, likewise, several members who are minorities. The executive board as well. And then we have various other boards like the United Pentecostal Foundation, the Church Loan Fund, Urshan Graduate School of Theology, Urshan College. So we have these related entities that each have their own boards. So every one of them also has minority representation. So on the general level, we have been intentional to the point where we still need more, but we can say every major board or committee, which I'd have to count them up, but say there are about 15. Every single one of them has minority representation, usually both Black and Hispanic. So now we're trying to make sure the districts understand this. And that's where I mentioned there's a 50% increase in the last 6 years on the district level. Again, we can't evade the election process. In some districts, like a place like Wyoming or a place like New Hampshire, the number of minorities may be very small. So it's not going to be realistic that every single district would elect a minority to the district board or a district department head. But I have to go back and look at the statistics, but the majority of our districts now would have a district board member who's a minority, or one of the district leaders, like the district men's minister or the district youth president, be elected by the constituents. So even though the majority probably is still Caucasian in most districts, yet they might elect a minority. And in some districts, the majority, like New York Metro, the majority of our constituents would be Hispanic or African American or Caribbean. So like in the New York district, almost every leader, almost the whole district board and every district leader is going to be Black or Hispanic. So when you look at that, I just came back from Hawaii, their district conference? Well, the vast majority of our constituents and almost all the leaders are some kind of minority, Asian, Hawaiian, African American, and then they, in turn, sit on the various national boards that they're represented. So through a natural process, the majority of our districts, for sure, have some minority leaders. Now, what's interesting is that's particularly true in places like the South. So like in Georgia, 2 of the board members are African American. But probably in both of those sections where they're elected, the majority of the ministers would still be Caucasian, but they chose an African American leader because they felt like that he perhaps had the largest church, was the most qualified, or the most senior, and that's who they wanted. So you go down the list. Alabama has an African American presbyter. Florida, so when you go these pockets, not only where minorities would be the majority, like New York City, but places where you would expect a significant, say, Black population or a significant Hispanic population. You're now seeing that reflected in the district leadership. Now, to go further with your question, we need to break this down. So here's where we are. I think we're doing a pretty good job on the high level, and we've done diversity training for our general board. So to answer your question, what are we doing practically? So what we're in the process of doing, and I've got a general board meeting next week, and we have a we newly created a position of full-time director of communications. So one of his many jobs is we're actually developing some videos of highlighting different voices in the UPCI. So I just previewed today one of our senior African-American pastors who talked about growing up. So he would have grown up at a time of segregation and racism. He was converted within the United Pentecostal Church as a college student, and how he loves the United Pentecostal Church because that's what saved it. But yet, as a young African-American student athlete, winning his Black friends, coming to a small, white, rural church in Alabama, guess what? He encountered some racism. So he tells the good and the bad, and he tells why he stuck it out, and he tells who helped him get a better perspective. And by better, I mean a positive perspective. I can deal with this, I can overcome this, I can make a difference, and what he's done, and then what he hopes for his kids. So that's a story worth telling, both the good and the bad. But that's a UPCI story. So those stories are all throughout our fellowship, but many people may not have ever heard them. So we have to tell our story. We're also doing some diversity training. We have what we call multicultural ministries. And so we have about 18 ethnic-based ministries, mostly on the basis of language groups. We also have what we call Building the Bridge ministries, which is trying to make sure the historic voice of African Americans always has a place in our fellowship. So not only to emphasize the importance of African Americans within the fellowship, but also making sure their unique contributions are shared. For instance, one of our large churches in New York City started what's called Appreciation Sunday. They came up with this idea in the midst of all these, the police shootings, the killings and all that. And they said, the vast majority of law enforcement people are good people. So you could take one incident and that causes polarization. But why don't we identify the good police in our city, invite them to our church, give them a certificate, pray over them, and say, we appreciate you, we love you, whether you're Black or white, we appreciate what you're doing. At the same time, they get to feel the presence of God, maybe the first time in apostolic service. So they call it Appreciation Sunday. Well, that has taken off across our fellowship. But notice, if I, as a Caucasian person, had said, let's do this, it could have been seen as a little bit suspect. But for an African American pastor to say, no, I feel like the Lord gave this to me, well, that's a contribution that is more authentic coming from an African American. So that's why we need the African American voice to be heard within our fellowship. That's the benefit of an interracial fellowship. So Building the Bridge Ministries, we call it, Spanish Evangelism Ministries, focusing on the Spanish language. So Multicultural Ministries is now working on a diversity curriculum that can be shared with the districts and even with local churches. So you were asking, I hope I'm not taking too much time to answer the question, but you're asking what are we doing? This is at the very first stages. We focused on leadership till now, training leaders, selling leaders. So I'm talking to the general board, I'm preaching at general conference to our ministers. So that's what we focus on. But we realize we've got to break this down. So now if we can provide training, video, and text from African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and Caucasians who have built multicultural churches.
Right.
People who are in interracial marriages. I mean, we have prominent pastors and even leaders who are in interracial marriage. So it's not just that we allow it, it's part of who we are. But they can tell their story in a way that everybody needs to hear. So we're trying to develop a curriculum that, say, a district superintendent can say, I want to show this to my ministers. Or a local church pastor can say, I want to show this to the leaders of my assembly. So that remains to be seen how that all is going to be fleshed out. But we already have some videos ready, and we're developing an entire curriculum. So to me, that's going to be very significant, very practical. It's in the beginning stages. We probably should have done it 25 years ago, but we're doing it.
Right. Good. Well, thank you. And that's good to hear. It's good to hear about those coming up in the works there. What do you say to those folks that might feel like the UPCI doesn't need a Building the Bridge ministry to reach African Americans? What do you say? Because there's some people out there that feel like, well, why do you need a particular ministry to reach African Americans? Why can't you just love them like you would love a white person or a Hispanic person?
And I get that. I understand that. And I'll tell you the history, so I'll be very candid with you. 40 years ago, we've always had some African American ministers from the very beginning. And I've traced that through our history, through the ministerial directors, to identify. Of course, you don't always know unless you study. The name will tell you if somebody's Hispanic. It doesn't tell you if somebody's black or white. But by studying it, we have identified, we've always had some African Americans. But 40 years ago, our leaders felt there was such a lack. So they created what they called Black Evangelism Ministries, or evangelism into the Black community. And so the intention was, how can we, of course, we want to win African Americans, or want to win everybody, but there's this big gap. Our churches are almost all white. What can we do to improve that? Now, we did become successful in some measure, a lot more African Americans in the churches, and then through the process of time, they want to be called to preach. They don't want to go to another organization to be a minister. They want to be a minister in our organization. So we became more diverse. So then, just what you said, well, if you have this Black evangelist, it sounds like you're a white organization trying to reach blacks. That's not the right thing to say. So how can we say we are a multiracial organization? Well, so maybe an easy thing might be to say, we'll just close down that ministry. Just everybody minister everybody. That would be the ideal, but that doesn't consider our history. So it's the same question of, well, why would you want to have affirmative action? Or why would you want to have any kind of program why would you want to have black colleges in America today? Why, in theory, you could say we should be so mature a society, we don't ever need to have that. But the real answer is there are centuries of inequity that you can't just wipe out. So our attempt was, let's change the name to Building the Bridge Ministries. So what we're trying to communicate, we're no longer almost completely white trying to reach blacks. We are blacks and whites trying to reach our world. But there still is a need to have a conversation about race. There still is a need to, since we are predominantly Caucasian, that's who we are in America, at least even right now. So we can't pretend that that's not the case. So what if an African American comes to us, he sees we're majority white, he wants to know, is there a place for me? So building the bridge is a way to say, we still, even though we're a multiracial organization, we want, and all of our members have access to all of our programs, and, you know, whether you're black or white, you could preach at General Conference, you could be elected to a position, you know, and we have that, you know. But building the bridge is a way of saying two things. There's always going to be a place for African Americans, that we recognize the uniqueness of our history. And two, we want to make sure the African American voice doesn't get lost. The unique contributions are going to come to the forefront. And that's why I mentioned Appreciation Sunday. So maybe one day we will evolve. We say, well, we don't even need that anymore. But it's at least our attempt, and by changing the name, it's no longer just black and white, and it's not just whites reaching blacks. It's all of us making sure we connect with each other. I look at it like this. Some people say, well, we just need a colorblind society. But actually, that's not what we want. We want to recognize the uniqueness of everybody. So, yes, in the sense of how we treat people, we should treat them with equality regardless of color. And that's what I think when people say, well, I don't see color, or we want to be colorblind. What they're trying to say, we want to treat everybody fairly with no discrimination, which I agree. But that can be interpreted by a minority person as, oh, as long as I conform to you, as long as I act white, well, then you love me. But if I try to be me,
right,
you know, to you, it sounds like, well, I'm colorblind. I love everybody equally. But to a minority, that might sound like, well, I love you as long as you are just like me. But if you want to be different, if you are different, if you have a different heritage, different color, or different history, or even different culture, well, then I don't belong. So perhaps the right answer is not colorblind, but appreciate diversity. So that's what the concept of building the bridge is. Let's not pretend there's no black, white, or other issue anymore. Let's celebrate it, and let's build bridges to one another. And if you feel like you don't need it anymore, well, great. But we didn't want to say suddenly, okay, this issue is not important anymore. If we just abolish the ministry, it's almost like saying, okay, we succeeded, no problem. And we don't want to do that. So yeah, I could see where some would say, well, that's still trying to segregate or separate or denigrate. That's not the intention at all. And of course, what I do as a General Superintendent, I depend on the advice of our African American ministers, because I realize I could be well-intentioned, and what I just shared with you sounds good to me. But if our leading African American minister said, no, Brother Bernard, this ministry is not effective, well, I will shut it down, because I would depend on them, just like with Spanish ministry. I'm going to depend on the Spanish-speaking ministers to tell me what works in the Hispanic community. I'm not the expert, but I trust those that will represent to me what they feel we need. And so it's an ongoing work. So we adjust the ministry and its goals based on the needs. But I'm going to depend on the advice of our leading African American pastors and Hispanic pastors and others, and we will continue to try to do what we feel is best for the whole.
Dr. Bernard, I appreciate your transparency on that. Thank you. What do you say, or what is your response to recent allegations that the UPCI has moved the Bible College, Urshid College and Urshid Graduate School of Theology away from North County because they're trying to run away from the problem of race or integration or What do you say to those recent allegations?
Yes. Well, when I heard that, it just caught me by surprise that I wasn't even thinking that way. So let me give you the background. As I said, we're a congregational church, so the real ministry is done by local churches. Our international headquarters is here. It was in Hazelwood. It's now in Weldon Spring. But our headquarters doesn't really minister to the community. It administrates all over the world. Likewise, Urshan College, Urshan Graduate School of Theology, we do have some local commuting students, but the vast majority of students are coming from all over the U.S. and Canada because the graduate schools are only seminary for a whole movement, and the undergraduate school is the only Christian liberal arts college and for a whole movement. And both, the graduate school is fully accredited, the undergraduate is in the process, it has candidacy. So we do have a number of other Bible colleges, and we appreciate them, but historically they weren't accredited. And so when we started Urshan College, we wanted to have an accredited school, and we didn't want to limit it to Bible college. We wanted to have a variety of majors. I take all that time to say the point is these two schools are not primarily ministering to St. Louis. They are national and international. So if you want to know, are we leaving North County? The answer is no. For instance, we have a church in Hazelwood that has expanded its facilities, and it has buses that run next door into Ferguson. We have a church in Bridgeton that just took oversight of a small congregation in Jennings, predominantly African American. The pastor retired. The building is in disrepair, and so they are remodeling the building and trying to get it up and running and rebuild the congregation. We have a Hispanic pastor in Maryland Heights who started the church. We just approved a few weeks ago a new church plant in Florissant. So if you want to look at what are we doing in North County and what are we doing among minorities in North County, we're actually, if you look at the local churches, we're investing more than we ever have before. Money, people, church plants is increasing. Now, why we move headquarters is a very simple thing. It's economics. We were in Hazelwood for almost 50 years. It was a great location, great time. But the building was getting old, and about half the building was our printing press. Well, because of the economics about 10 years ago, we closed down the printing press. It's much cheaper with digital printing now to outsource printing. If we try to keep a printing press, we have to invest millions of dollars every few years in technology. Our business is not printing. Our business is preaching the gospel. So we shut down the printing press, leaving us this huge warehouse that we couldn't use. The building was old, so the heating and air was not zones for the whole building. So we're having to run the whole building, and we can't use half the building. So we looked at options. What can we do? We're outgrowing this, but yet we have all this unused space. We have high maintenance. We have utilities. We have to replace the roof. And so we just did an analysis. Can we rent out half of it? That didn't work. Can we remodel? Well, that was going to be more costly than new construction. So then we looked, well, what about comparable buildings in the area that we could just move into? And then if we couldn't find one in St. Louis, I said, let's look at Dallas, because St. Louis was chosen as the central hub when transportation was by car and rail. But most of our transportation of our executives here is by air. Our executives are traveling every week all across the U.S., all across the world. So maybe we should look at an air hub like Dallas. So we looked at all these options. Well, miraculously, this building was built about 10 years ago for $17 million. And we were able to buy it for $8 million.
Wow.
And the reason why is it was a real estate investment company that decided to leave the St. Louis area. So they were selling all properties. They had already made half their money through renting. So they were just basically getting the other half of their money out. So they said, if you'll buy it, we were able to sell our old building for about $4 million. We bought this one for $8 million. We collected $1 million of rent that was still due from the last tenant. And we got all the furnishings and equipment. So basically, we only had to finance about $3 million on this building, which we were able to do internally. And here's the kicker. By making this move, we were able to save maintenance and utilities of $18,000 per month.
Wow.
That is what it took to finance the other $3 million. So instead of going to a bank and borrowing money, we just borrowed cash reserves, and we're using those monthly savings to pay back ourselves. In essence, we're walking into this new building for free. We didn't have to raise any money. We didn't have to increase the budget. We didn't have to ask anybody. We just took the same operating budget that was operating a 50-year-old building, and we moved to this with 50% more usable space, no extra cost. So I took a lot of time here, but it's a 100% economic decision.
Yeah.
It's no, it's no other component there. And to us, it was a miracle, because when we did the analysis, we didn't think there would be something like this. Well, without going through the whole thing, the college campus is the same. Because of accreditation, we're at capacity. The buildings are great, but the oldest building was built in 1840. The next building was built in 1900. We're having to spend millions of dollars in upgrades. And when we weren't at capacity, we could kind of get by. But now that we're at capacity, it's straining the old plumbing. We have the heater is a boiler system that's campus-wide, steam. We don't have air conditioning in the dorms because not only is it costly, but the electrical supply would not support air conditioning. So we did a similar analysis. Because of our capacity, we're going to have to spend at least $1 million to upgrade existing buildings. We'll have to spend about $6 million to build a new building just to accommodate what we anticipate this year. So we did all that analysis. We looked at, we're out of housing. Can we buy houses around there just to provide housing for students? And again, we found this 43-acre facility in Wentzville, and it's appraised for $7 million. We were able to buy it for $5.4 million.
Wow.
We're trying to sell our campus for about $5 million. We are going to have to do some upgrades, but basically, immediately, we're going to double our facilities, double our square footage of usable buildings, double our campus. And if we can sell our existing campus the way we plan,
Right.
it's going to be with a very small financial investment. So again, we're trying to accommodate doubling our capacity. So it's just hard to do that in North County,
Right.
Economically, when, on the outlying areas, you've got these opportunities. And since we're not really ministering in North County, it's a national ministry. And so the reason it's not a white flight, it's not a racial thing, it's an economic and it's a growth. And if you want to look at it that way, the board members who made these decisions are multiracial board members. We have African Americans, Hispanics, who are on the Urshan board, the general board. All the people making these decisions, if it was a racial thing, that they would bring that to our attention. But that wasn't even in the discussion. So that just kind of shocked me. I can see why, if someone is already skeptical, already feels like they've been hurt, they might jump to that conclusion. But I think it's a mistake to compare it to like someone moving their residence to an international organization trying to find bigger space for growth and finding what we regard as a miracle. God just giving us these major properties with little or no cost. I mean, that's an answered prayer.
That is a miracle, and God has definitely blessed the organization. I can tell you that much, because this facility is beautiful. I've toured it,
yes,
and it is beautiful. So God has definitely blessed you all. What would you say to a person that may feel like they have experienced discrimination in one of our local churches? I know you mentioned that the local churches govern themselves.
Yes.
The headquarters don't micromanage them or control them. So what advice would you give a certain individual if they are feeling discriminated by their local pastor and maybe it's a legitimate,
Yes.
discrimination.
Sure. It's real. Yeah.
It is real,
Yeah.
allegation. So, what type of advice would you give that person?
Well, the first thing I would say is go to the pastor. In our structure, the pastor is the overseer of the local church. And I would hope and pray and believe that he would not be racist, that he would welcome people of all races. And so if there's an act of discrimination, he needs to know, because he's in the best position to deal with it. When I was a pastor, this is what I would say. I would, from time to time, I would preach or at least mention against racism and the kind of things we've already discussed. And usually I would add this tagline. Now, we welcome everyone. Our vision is diversity, minorities. We're trying to do our best. However, I cannot guarantee that you'll never encounter any problem. We're all sinners saved by grace. Some people who are coming here are not yet saved. Some were saved but not yet living a holy life. Some are ignorant and insensitive. You may have some that still have racist or discriminatory mentality, which is a sin, but it's not shocking that there might be sin among people. So I can't guarantee as a pastor you'll never encounter that. But if you do, please come to me. I need to know. I want to work with you. I want to do what I can to help the situation. So I would hope our ministers would have that attitude. And so I would say if someone is a member of a local church, probably they do have confidence in their pastor, or they would never stuck it out. So I would say give them a chance. If there's a problem, don't just assume he knows about it. Don't just assume he doesn't care. Don't just assume that's the attitude of the church. Go talk to him. And if he's sincere, and this is another thing I did, which I told you on the national level, but I had meetings from time to time with some of our minority members, especially African Americans, to say, look, I don't claim to be the expert. There's some things I might say or do or not say or do that I don't even realize the significance. I'm depending on you to help me out. If I make a mistake, I need you to tell me. Or I would say, I've got some plans. I'll run them by you. What do you think? And so perhaps your pastor would appreciate someone saying, well, Pastor, when this happened, something was said from the pulpit or something was said in the Sunday school class to my kid. This is, and the pastor might say, well, I'm sorry, but how can we fix that? So you might be the person to help. So I'd say, first of all, go to your pastor. Or if there's another trusted leader that you are connected to, go to somebody in leadership. Not attacking, not condemning, but just being honest. Don't feel like you have to hide, or don't feel like nobody's going to listen. At least try. And you might be surprised. Now, if it's persistent and nobody cares, well, I would be very sad for that, but you may have to find another church. You can't fix everything. If it's a minister, I would. Now, again, we handle things on the local level. So if it's a problem with a minister, the best person would be what we call the presbyter or the district superintendent. So you wouldn't come immediately to me. We've got 10,500 ministers. You'd go to the bishop over that area. So we call him a sectional presbyter, and then the next level is a district superintendent. So if it's involving one of our ministers, I would say go to that person.
Great. Well, Dr. David Bernard, I appreciate your time, sir. I'm not sure if you had anything else you wanted to add to this interview, recent allegations that's out there, anything like that you want to add, but you have answered all my questions, and I tell you, it's been a pleasure, it's been an honor, but I'm going to give you this opportunity if you wanted to add anything for our viewers.
Well, thank you. And I don't think I need to, there's some misunderstandings that I think I've helped clear up, but I'm not here to try to defend everything, because maybe there are some things that are wrong that we need to work on. But I would simply say, when all of this happened, I was thankful that we did not have to create a response. But over the last few years, we've written papers on racism, on diversity. We've started tracking our statistics. We had messages at recent conferences, articles in our Pentecostal Life. by African Americans as well as by other leaders like me. So we have a lot of resources that give the context. So we don't have to just write, well, here's one accusation, here's how we respond. We have a variety of videos and articles that we've developed over the last 5 or 10 years that if you want to get the complete story, it's available. So you could go to our website, upci.org, or you can go to Facebook, to the UPCI page on Facebook, and you could easily get a variety of resources, statements, videos, and I would just simply say we're going to be having more come out, as I alluded to, voices of the UPCI, diversity training. So my bottom line is I believe we're headed in the right direction. We weren't always where we were now, so we've had a lot of inadequacies and faults and failures, and we still have a significant way to go, but I do believe we're headed in the right direction. We are diverse. We're seeing great success. And internationally, we have an international global council. So it's no longer just North Americans who are in control, but we have world leaders who work together. We have mature churches in many countries of the world. And so we're making great progress. The future is bright. And if you're part of our fellowship or want to be part of our fellowship, partner with us and make it better. You're part of the solution. If you're not part of our fellowship, and you have your own, and that's fine. We respect you. We want to partner with you, and we want to befriend you and respect you, because there is a room for not only diversity within an organization, but different organizations can have different missions and different places of service, and that's okay too. But we do have to talk to each other. We do have to have fellowship. We do have to love one another, and so we're trying to grow the kingdom of God.
Amen, amen. Well, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor to sit here with you, sir. I appreciate every value you have demonstrated, and I want to thank our viewers for viewing. Those that are going to be watching on Facebook, and those that are going to be listening at KXEN 1010 AM here at our local radio station. I want to thank you guys again for tuning in for this special interview with Dr. David Bernard. Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure.
God bless you. Thank you for the opportunity as well.
Thank you.
Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save.